Hello friends, the Bourbon Nerd here. Welcome to lesson 7 in my bourbon school. So today I am going to talk about whiskey aging, how you age whiskey. This is a really big topic, a favorite of mine, and I just want to give you a little bit of a preview because in the lessons following this, I'll go in depth with some of the things I'm going to discuss today because I cannot cover everything with whiskey aging in just one lesson here. So as you can see on the screen here, I'll talk about weird stuff like Devil's Cut and Angel Share and barrel entry proof and also charring and toasting, etc. Don't worry about some of the things I'll talk about in this lesson will be a little bit too high level because in the following lessons I will go in a lot of details. And in fact, to support me in this episode, I'm actually sipping on a Major Pingree 13-year. It's a fantastic whiskey. If you never heard about this brand, check them out. They actually do some really great stuff. So cheers, y'all. Very nice. Okay, so let's get started. So I want to take you through the legal definition of what is actually required in terms of aging. So for most of the whiskey types, so I'm talking about bourbon here, rye, wheat whiskey and all that. As you can see on the screen here, this is very specific wording here that it must be aged in new charred oak containers. And I'm actually gonna dissect that sentence for the remainder of this lesson, and I'm gonna do this a little bit in reverse. I'm gonna talk about the containers first, then the oak, and then the charring, and then why it needs to be new. Okay, so let's dig into it. So first, containers. Well, containers, it's actually, you see 3 different types here. I have a bucket on the far left here. Obviously, no one wants to age their whiskey in buckets. You know, evaporation will make everything go in very quick time here. So nothing will want to do that. But it's actually legal to store your whiskey or age your whiskey in a bucket there. Of course, you have this wooden box there. For practical reasons, they're a little bit difficult to handle, except with very there's a couple of exceptions, but no one really uses the boxes as well. Most, of course, next to me here are using the barrels for storing whiskeys. Okay, and in terms of these barrels, a standard American whiskey barrel is 53 gallons, which is about 200 liters. There are people that go a little bit higher, which this screenshot here doesn't really indicate. Some use 57 or 59 gallon barrels, but it's not very common. But the smaller ones here, as you see on the screen, a lot of craft distilleries are trying to dabble a little bit with smaller barrels because the whiskey to wood ratio, you know, there's a lot more wood surface per liter or per gallon of whiskey. So people are experimenting with smaller barrels to get the aging process going a little bit faster. We'll get onto that. But everybody uses barrels, as I said, you know, because you can see here, you know, a full barrel of whiskey actually weighs about 550 pounds. And even despite that it's so heavy, you know, you can just roll it. So as you can see in the picture, it can be handled by a single man, which is why everybody are using barrels and not boxes of, and obviously not buckets. Okay. So the second word from reverse here is oak. So just in case you have forgotten what an oak tree looks like, here you can see, beautiful tree. It takes forever to grow to this size. This is a couple of 100 years old, at least I'm sure. And that's also part of the strength with oak because of the very slow growth, the sort of density becomes really tight. The molecules are very close to each other, and that's part of the strength because it helps sort of the integrity of the barrel. It helps keep the liquid inside. Okay, there are like 500 different species of oak out there. Some of them are absolutely fantastic and some of them are really bad at holding the liquor in the barrel, which is sort of the whole purpose of making the barrel. So here I have on the screen here some very common used oak species, American whitewood oak and American red oak. And even though they look very similar, their ability to hold liquor is very and all kind of liquid is very different. As you can see here on the screen, These are 2 cubes of American white oak and American red oak that has been soaking in a little bath of alcohol for like, I think 10 or 15 minutes. And as you can see in the far left, the American white oak, it has, of course, it's wet, but that's sort of the part of the wood block there that's actually residing in the alcohol bath itself. Just next to me, where we had the American red oak, it's almost soaked completely through. So that's just the way that this oak species is constructed. It can contain a lot of liquid, but it's not very good at keeping the liquid on one of the sides. So for American red oak, it's not something that you really want to use for barrel aging. The most popular species out there, American white oak, as you just saw, is sort of the #1 in the world because it's relatively plentiful and the molecule structure is very dense. So it is extremely good at holding the liquor inside once the barrel is made in a good way. There are also European oak types, French one being the most predominant, but also to a certain extent Spanish oak. And then finally, there are several types, several species of Japanese oak. The Mizunara oak, you may have heard about this before because it's very expensive. It gives some fantastic flavors to the whiskey. It's also a little bit poorer at holding the liquor inside the barrel, but it's very popular because it has some fantastic notes from the barrel to the whiskey. All right. Then the third word is charred. So believe it or not, by law, those barrels that you just built have to be burnt on the inside, and I'll explain to you in a second why that is. As you can see here, it's quite dramatic. I've been to a cooperage, which is the place where you make a barrel, and they just turn this on fire, a big gas flame source, and they keep it on there until they're basically charred on the inside here. And in terms of how much burning they actually do on the barrels here, on the next slide here, I have a couple of examples. They're talking about these char levels. Char level 1 just next to me is sort of like the lowest char level. This is actually burned only 15 to 20 seconds. And then even though the scale go up to 7 or 8 and even beyond, most people stop at char level 4 to the far left here. It's also something called alligator char. You can see it's almost like, it looks like the back of an alligator. And that's about 55 to 60 seconds to get to this point, right? And then why on earth would you burn a newly made barrel on the inside? And why is this a rule, right? So 2 weird pictures here on the screen maybe. So the guy on the far left is a minister. This is Elijah Craig. We did talk about him in a previous lesson. So he's the guy from Heaven Hill. Elijah Craig, it's one of their brands, and he is sort of, at least according to Heaven Hill, he's sort of given, he was sort of the inventor of bourbon. And the story goes that one night his barn caught fire because of lightning. Some of the barrels, completely freshly new made barrels there, they also caught fire and they were burned heavily on the inside. Elijah Craig had a lot of whiskey that he had to transport down the Ohio River to New Orleans. And he didn't really have an alternative, so he said, okay, what the hell, I'm going to put the whiskey into the barrels anyway, even though they are charred. And what happened was that when they arrived in New Orleans, I guess 30, 40, 60 days later, something like this, of course, the whiskey had turned from this completely transparent color into this very nice and dark color. And everybody, of course, understood that this was, of course, of the charring, right? But the whiskey also tasted much better, which no one understood. And I'm going to explain to you in a second why that is. So that's one theory. The other theory, which is probably the right one, even though Elijah, I love your story, but it's probably not the right one. The picture next to me is, of course, of a barrel of salted herring. And if you wonder why that is on the screen right now, is that those barrels, just like today, were very expensive to make. So once you transported, for instance, herring or coins or nails or even oil sometime, you can imagine trying to use that barrel again for transporting whiskey is a no-go for obvious reasons, right? So people were experimenting with burning the inside of the barrel to get rid of whatever taste and smell, of course, that remains of what the previous occupancy of this barrel was. And that actually turns out to be something that you could do. So if you have a barrel full of herring and you empty it from the herring and you burn it on the inside for like a minute or so, you can actually neither smell or taste anything from that herring. So that's what they did. That is probably the more plausible explanation of this. And as I promised, I'll explain to you why the whiskey is suddenly also tasting better. And I just love nature here. So if you look at this picture, it's actually a stave that I sort of cut in half, that I got from a cooperage. And if you see here, there are sort of two lines there. There's one called the red line and another line that's called the soak line. So the red line, that is just underneath the charring. And what happens is that when you burn wood, it tries to shove, the natural wood sugars towards the heat flame, the heat source. And when the heat source meets the wood sugars, it turns into caramel, which is sort of very, very difficult to burn through. So it's a way for the wood to protect itself, right? But that also means that the whiskey inside, on the other side of this char level here, on the char side, actually gets closer interaction with the wood sugars itself, because all the good taste that you have in the whiskey comes from the nice wood sugars and all the compounds in there, including vanillin, which is the ingredient, the active ingredients in vanilla, etc., etc., etc. So there's also the other thing is, you see this soak line, which is also almost going 2/3 down the barrel stave here. And what is happening is that when you fill the barrel with whiskey at the production plant, right? You fill it to the top. You obviously want to leverage the barrel as much as you can. You then put it into the storage facility in the warehouse. And when it becomes summer, the heat increases. And when you have a confined liquid and the heat increases, the pressure increases as well. So the liquor, the alcohol, the whiskey is literally trying everything it can do to penetrate the wood to get out, because it has expanded because of the heat, right? And as you can see here, it's done a pretty good job. It's 2/3 in, almost through the barrel. And that's also why sometimes when you have a distillery tour, you will see some barrels are leaking a little bit, because it's sort of gone all the way through here, but it's done the best there. So while the whiskey is inside the wood, it grabs all these nice flavors that you really want to get from the whiskey. And then when winter comes, sort of the liquid contracts again. So it's outside the wood in the summer, into the wood in the winter, outside the wood. So you talk about the whiskey, it's breathing. And depending on how many sort of cycles in and out of the wood, the whiskey becomes more and more dark, as you can see here, but it also have more and more flavor. Of course, at one point it becomes too much, and then you sort of stop it because you don't want to get it completely over. So it's a very, very fascinating how nature works. So that's actually how you get all the good taste from whiskey. And of course the color, that's the interaction with the wood. And of course the coloring come a lot from the charring, as you can see here. All right. And then the final word in this new charred oak container, right? It has to be new by law. And this is something that is, I think, maybe even unique to the United States. Most other places around the world, it doesn't have to be new. So new basically meaning that once you have used a barrel for aging whiskey one time, it can never be used for aging at least that type of whiskey before again. So this goes for bourbon and rye, which are the two, predominant whiskey types. So after you have used this barrel literally only one time, you have to either destroy it or sell it on, which is what everybody's doing, right? So a lot of the used barrels are being sold to, for instance, Scotland. If you ever see on the label of a Scotch whiskey, it says in ex-bourbon casks, that's basically because they're taking an empty barrel from the US that has been used just once for making, for instance, bourbon. They buy it, send it to Scotland, and then they sort of store their own whiskey there. And as you can see on the screen here, this is really fascinating. So these are two whiskies here. They're sort of the same proof point, around 120, 130. One has been stored in an oak barrel for 2 years, the other one in 18 years, for 18 years. So the one that you would think it's a reverse, but actually the one to the far left is a bourbon, and it's been stored for 2 years. I will grant it in intense heat in Texas for this particular brand. So that's why in just 2 years, it has this incredible dark color. And the other one just next to me has been aged in used bourbon casks. Maybe bourbon casks that have been used maybe more than once, maybe twice. And even though it has stayed there for 18 years, it still had this very, very light color. So very, very fascinating. So that's why for quality purposes and also color purposes, in the United States, it has to be a new charred oak container to do that. Right. And that's basically it for the basic thing there. But I just want to let you know there are a couple of exceptions to this overall rule that I showed you. For instance, corn whiskey. As you can see on the far left, mellow corn here. Mellow corn does not have to be stored in a new charred oak container. In fact, it doesn't even have to be aged in oak at all. It is the one whiskey type in the US that don't have any requirements for being aged in oak. It can just be aged in a steel container, which makes sure that it'll stay this color here. And it's basically turning into moonshine. You also call it corn whiskey, of course. And then the one next to me is from Michter's. It's a fantastic product called American Unblended. This has this category just called whiskey. And you think it's a little bit of a weird name because everything is whiskey, right? But if there's a whiskey that sort of does not adhere to the other rules, it sort of falls back to the basic category, which is just called whiskey. And this whiskey here next to me has not been stored in new barrels. It's actually been stored in used, new barrel, but it has been stored in used barrels. And that means that it sort of breaks the rules for bourbon and for rye. So it has to fall into this category called just whiskey. And despite that, it is a fantastic whiskey. If you don't know this particular product, I definitely urge you to check it out. So there are exceptions to this rule. And of course, the final step is that the aging is done and you want to dump it out of the barrel. That's actually the term that they use in the industry. It's called dumping. And you basically remove the bung from the bung hole, you turn it over, as you can see here on the picture, and then sort of it empties out as much as it can. And as you can see at the bottom of the trough here, there's a lot of char pieces there. It's part of the charring process, and you obviously don't want that in your bottle. So there's a little bit of filtration going on here, but that's it, right? So once you dumped it, you either put it directly into the bottles, undiluted at all. That's what is referred to as cask strength. Or you top it off with water until you get to that proof level that you're looking for, 80 proof, 90 proof, whatever. So for most whiskey types, the water is the only thing you can add from when you dump the barrel into you get the whiskey into the bottle. Cool. Yeah, that was it. So easy peasy, right? So basically a lot of stuff going on inside the barrel. It's this interaction with the wood that gives you all the color and all the nice flavors. And as I promised just here in the last slide here, I will come back in the next handful of sessions and lessons or so where I'll go into details with these specific topics. So I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you for listening. Cheers.